This is the story of an extraordinary children's escape from the Nazis on the eve of the Second World War. Fearing mass persecution and death, some Jewish parents sent their children away to safety in Britain. The children who made the journey, now in their 80s, treasure the memories of the families they left behind.
My dear parents must be when they were first married. 1914, that is.
The last goodbyes still haunt the children who left for a new life in Britain. Their parents hid from them the fact that they might never meet again.
I've got a letter here from Tommy, my brother, asking me how I like England and how much he'd like to be with me there.
Special trains from Prague to London took the children away from Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia to safety. The unlikely hero behind this rescue was a young London stockbroker, Nicholas Winton.
I felt convinced of the dire necessity of something to be done. It was merely the idea, which I suppose must have originally come from the families. Look, if you can't get us out, can you get our children out?
But not all the trains Winton chartered got through. The children on one that didn't ended up not in England, but in Hitler's concentration camps. Their tragic loss is one of Nicholas Winton's greatest regrets, but it doesn't diminish from this remarkable story of Britain's secret Schindler. The rise to power of the Nazi Party in Germany during the 1930s replaced democracy with dictatorship led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler's ambition was to rebuild Germany's military strength with the ultimate dream of the total domination of Europe. His regime was based on the persecution of alleged enemies within, most of all, the Jews. Most of Europe viewed the threat posed by the regime with growing unease. One of the few in England who saw the urgent need for action was Nicholas Winton. Born in 1909 into a London banking family with German and Jewish roots, he was perfectly placed to know about the persecution of the Jews.
I knew exactly what was going on in Germany because we even had relatives and friends whom we were given sanctuary to in our home. We knew from them what was going on, and although at that time, of course, the real bestiality of the Nazi regime hadn't started, one knew of the general persecution that was happening.
Along with the Jews, the other main targets for Nazi persecution were communists and trade unionists. The attacks on them by Hitler's supporters left Germany in a virtual state of civil war. Some families, fearing for their lives, began to move away to the safety of neighboring countries, like Czechoslovakia. Suzanne Maydas's father was in serious danger. He was editor of a left-wing German newspaper. He was also a Jew.
When we fled from Germany, we really had to leave pronto. We left immediately. We left behind our house. And when we got to Czechoslovakia, we were welcomed there with open arms. There was no distinction between Jewish or not Jewish. I don't remember anti-Semitism in Czechoslovakia.
Czechoslovakia was an island of calm in a turbulent Eastern Europe. It seemed the perfect safe haven. Progressive, prosperous and multicultural, with more than 20% of its population German-speaking. Families of Jewish descent living here had no idea that very soon their comfortable lives would be turned upside down. Eve Leadbeater wasn't even aware that her family was Jewish. They were Czechs.
I was born in Prague and we lived near the centre, near Wenceslas Square. It was above my father's practice. He was a lawyer. I used to know him as Tati. In Czech it would be Tati. One of my best memories of my father was him taking me through the streets of Prague and buying me from one of the stalls a pork sausage, a kind of hamburger with lashings of lovely Czech mustard.
Many of the children that Nicholas Winton saved fondly remember a childhood that 70 years on seems idyllic. One of them, growing up in a Jewish family in the Sudetenland which bordered Germany, was Gerda Meyer. She adored her father.
My father had a small dress shop selling ladies' coats and dresses, and I think he had sort of artistic ambitions, and I think he persuaded himself that it was somehow artistic.
Like her father, Gerda also wanted to be artistic, and as a child, she began writing poetry.
I remember being in a meadow with a lot of flowers. One morning in a Sunday meadow I was aware. The flowers shone, the sky was bright. I knew that I was happy there.
Eve Leadbeater loved and admired her older brother Tommy, and they enjoyed many days playing out in the countryside together.
His name was Tomáš, but he was called Tommy. I just remember my brother as, I thought, very handsome, and I was going to marry him when I grew up, if I didn't marry my father. And he was just fun to be with.
Such childhood innocence would soon be cut short. In March 1938, Hitler took control of Austria, which became part of the new German Empire, almost encircling Czechoslovakia. This is where he would make his next move, the Sudetenland. Here, the Czech-speaking Germans were in the majority, and many were becoming Nazis. Amongst them, even a few innocent young Jewish children.
All the towns were very Nazi. You had little swastikas chalked all over town on the walls. But then my cousin once went round and said, "Oh, I did something really naughty. I went doing swastikas all over the town," you know. So I think one wasn't all that, yes, he was about 8 or so. So he thought he was very daring doing it.
But very soon, Hitler's deadly intentions would become clear. Jewish families and their children were in serious danger. The Nazi dream of a new German empire that spread across the whole of Europe was viewed with growing alarm. In 1938, the fate of Czechoslovakia hung in the balance as the Nazis provoked a crisis in the Czech Sudetenland. Many of the 3.5 million German-speaking Czechs demanded that they be allowed to become part of Hitler's Third Reich. The 25,000 Jews they lived alongside, many of them middle-class families, felt under threat. Vera Penny's parents ran a successful business just inside the Czech border.
One time I remember I was in the room with men and women coming in and talking, discussing situations in the world. I remember they were arguing about things. My mother was constantly worried about what was going on in the world, and with these people going in and out, it was a difficult time for children because we were constantly sent out of the room to let the adults argue.
Attempts to prevent war in Europe culminated in the Munich Agreement of September 1938, in which British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain brokered a deal with Hitler. It forced the Czech government to concede the Sudetenland to Nazi Germany. Chamberlain returned home a hero.
We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire never to go to war with one another again.
But the enthusiasm with which Sudeten towns greeted the German army of occupation convinced many Jewish families that it was time to go. To Gerda Meyer, moving to Prague seemed like a great adventure.
I was walking through the rooms, because we left all our furniture and everything, and I sort of rather dramatizing myself, you know, little girl leaving her childhood home. But part of me thought, oh, goody, goody, there's the sort of lights of Prague, and I'm going to have a lot of adventure, and we are going to be romantically poor, you see. I've got it all out of stories. And my mother had said, oh, Hitler, the Czechs will have beaten Hitler in a week's time. And I remember thinking, well, maybe if I'm lucky, he won't be defeated for a fortnight, and then I'll have a longer time away from school.
Following in the footsteps of his army of occupation, Hitler whipped up the German-speaking majority to embrace wide-ranging anti-Jewish laws. Jews were declared non-citizens and their civil rights were abolished. They were barred from continuing their businesses and their professional work. Faced with this, Harry Stadler's family decided to abandon their comfortable life in Pilsen for an uncertain future in Prague.
It was a sad story, really, because I loved it there. The teachers were wonderful. And I remember my last farewell to my Czech teacher when I was standing on the steps going up to the second floor of school and telling her that I was terribly sorry we were moving to Prague and I wouldn't be coming back in the autumn. And she cried. And she said, oh, but I'm so terribly sorry. You do know that we are not responsible.
Within 10 days, the annexation of the Sudetenland was complete. And as the harsh anti-Semitic laws began to bite, many Jewish middle-class families became refugees virtually overnight. The Penny family collected together what possessions they could and tramped the streets of Prague, now crowded with refugees. They slept in the railway station whilst looking for somewhere to stay.
There was a room in this flat, but there was one man living in it already, and as there had been nowhere else for us to go by the time we'd got to Prague, we had to take that room. And I remember that my mother was very worried. She turned up all the beds of the bedclothes because that way she could tell whether there were nasties in the bed, fleas and so on.
Out of this anxious period in our history, one fact emerges in stark sorrow, the distress of those Czechs who have lost their homes and possessions. Britain's sympathy is proved by the response to the Lord Mayor's appeal, and these pictures prove the need of the response.
The plight of the thousands of Czech Jewish refugees touched the conscience of Britain. It inspired young London stockbroker Nicholas Winton to abandon his skiing holiday and instead fly to Prague. It would be the beginning of a life-changing journey.
When I went to Prague, my contact was the representative in Prague of the British Committee of Refugees from Czechoslovakia, Doreen Warrener. She said, I think the best thing you can do is to go to the camps and see how these refugees are living. I went to the camps, and what I saw from that was that although Doreen Warrener was getting out a lot of the families who were in danger, she couldn't by any means deal with everybody who wanted to get out. And a lot of the families said, well, if we can't get out, at least we must try and get our children out.
The mood in Prague darkened as it became clear that despite the sympathy for the Jewish refugees, no government was prepared to take action to stop Hitler and his persecution of the Jews. An easygoing cosmopolitan city was becoming fraught with racial tension, and Jewish children were given disturbing instructions from their parents.
We had to keep quiet about being Jewish. I had no idea that we were Jewish because we were Czech. My parents were hugely patriotic. I can remember hearing the name Hitler and knowing that it was something frightening, but I didn't know any details, of course. I didn't understand. But I did take it seriously that we shouldn't tell anybody that we were Jews.
Anti-Semitism remained barely visible in the polite society of Prague's fashionable cafes and meeting places. It reared its ugly head, first of all, amongst school children. One of the victims was Suzanne Modas.
I turned up at school as usual, and I was about to go up the stairs, and the girls at the top of the stairs shouted, "Here comes the Jewish pig. Here kommt das Judenschwein." Now, first of all, I don't know how they knew I was Jewish, except that I had a Jewish surname, Bernstein. But obviously, they knew something had happened. And I went into my classroom, and I soon realized that former friends suddenly were no longer friends.
But there was a glimmer of hope for the city's Jewish community. It was rumored that there was an Englishman in Prague who was putting together a list of families who were in most danger with a view to finding them a home in Britain. He was in the Europa Hotel in Wenceslas Square, and he was working with Doreen Warrener's refugee group. Few even knew his name.
All that people knew via Doreen's office was that there was an Englishman hovering about in Prague who was trying to get the children out if the parents couldn't get permits to go.
Convinced of the urgent need to help these families, Winton wrote to the British Committee for Czechoslovakia in London.
The morale of these families has to a certain extent been maintained by the fact that they have been given to believe that at least the kids would be able to leave the country. If something is not done soon, the people will completely despair and sink slowly into complete degradation.
In January 1939, after just 3 weeks in Prague, Nicholas Winton returned to England. With time running out, he knew that organizing the children's escape from the Nazis was a matter of life or death.
What reinforced our opinion that we thought it could only get worse was just the fact that all these families thought things were so bad that they were even going to risk getting rid of their children, so at least the children could be saved.
In the early hours of March the 15th, 1939, barely 2 months after Winton left Prague for London, the German army crossed the borders of Czechoslovakia. The following morning, tanks rolled into the streets of Prague. Hitler had broken the Munich Agreement, certain that Britain and the other European powers would not come to the rescue of the Czechs. He was right. It was a terrible shock for Jewish families, still vividly remembered by Vera Schanfield.
I was 9 years old, and my parents and my nurse were sitting listening to the radio, and suddenly I felt a whole atmosphere of fear, and I realized that something awful was happening. I remember my nurse saying that England has let us down. Then, suddenly, there were German soldiers in the streets, and within 2 or 3 days only, my father was arrested.
The new Nazi regime used the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, to intimidate the Czech population with random arrests. Nobody was safe, and the Jewish refugee families lodging in Prague's tenement slums were vulnerable to night raids.
We'd be in our beds very tense, listening to which floor of this huge building they would end up to come and look for people. And I was told to cling to my father's, if it was in the night, well, during the day where we were out of there, but at night, I was told to cling to his pyjama bottoms and be crying. And my sister was told to lie in the bed with the bedclothes up to her nose so that she couldn't be seen as a teenager. And we know why now, don't we?
Back in London, Nicholas Winton had returned to work in the city, but he spent every spare minute trying to persuade the government to allow the Jewish refugee children into Britain. There was sympathy for their plight, but a mountain of bureaucracy to overcome.
The first thing I had to do was to find out if it was possible. And there I worked on my belief that if something's not impossible, there must be a way of doing it. And there was a way of doing it because the Home Office gave me the conditions under which I worked.
The Home Office ruled that Winton would have to find a family for each child and also pay for their travel. He spent his evenings raising money from charities, but his greatest triumph was to come up with an extraordinary scheme in which would-be guardian parents chose and helped pay for the child they wanted.
If somebody, say up in Wigan, said, yes, we'll take a girl of about 10, I would send them a card with 10 girls of about 10 and said, here, take your choice. It's an awful way of doing things, but it was very effective and very quick.
Back in Prague, the dedicated team that worked with Winton moved swiftly once confirmation arrived from London that a child on his list had been found a home. Trevor Chadwick organised the Czech end of the operation. He dealt with the travel arrangements and tried to assure the families that their children would be in safe hands.
My parents had been very happy that I was going to go to safety. I mean, I knew where I was going, you see. Trevor Chadwick showed us pictures of the school I was going to attend.
The first Winton evacuation to London was by plane in March 1939. One of the 20 children who left was Gerda Meyer.
I can hardly remember saying goodbye. I don't think there was much fuss. I think it was all done in a great hurry. It was quite a small plane, and I remember my father running after the plane and trying to take a photograph of it.
The success of the first evacuation inspired Winton and his team to save every child they could from the hands of the Nazis. Between April and August 1939, 7 Winton trains left Prague, bringing a total of 669 children to safety in Britain. Then a dramatic turn of events brought the evacuation scheme to a sudden end. Through the summer of 1939, the Winton trains brought hundreds of children from Prague to London. On the 2nd of June, 123 children. On the 1st of July, 241 children. On the 20th of July, 76 children. There to greet them all on Liverpool Street Station was Nicholas Winton himself.
All these children came off the train. The problem was to get the right child to the right new parent, which nearly always worked out quite well.
In Prague, Winton's team were overwhelmed by the number of Jewish parents desperate to get their children away to safety in Britain. To speed things up, they sometimes had to cut corners.
What we did on certain occasions was to have the documents that should have been printed in London printed in Prague, and when the person with this fake document arrived at Harwich, we had the official document. We took away the false one and gave them the official one.
The Czech government in exile helped set up a school in mid-Wales for Czech refugee children, designed to help keep their culture and language alive. But they were a privileged few. Most Winton children went to ordinary schools all over Britain in the towns and villages where they were sent. Like many, Vera Penny learnt English very quickly from her guardians and got so used to using it, she almost forgot her mother tongue.
Liebes Veroline, deinen Brief. You can imagine how delighted your mum was to get your letter on Tuesday, but my dear child, you're not telling me all the things I want to know. I didn't write very often because in actual fact I had to use a dictionary, and that was quite tiresome for a little girl. That was why my mother wrote back to say, would I write this, that and the other, but she obviously didn't really understand that I couldn't. Please write back straight away and read my letter through once more before you reply. Be obedient and polite, and above all, keep yourself clean.
Letters from her mother and father kept Gerda Meyer in touch with her family and evoked memories of happier times. Her father's thoughts and feelings had a special meaning for Gerda.
My father wrote really beautiful letters about going to his own family home And he said what a pity it was that there wasn't a market day, and it was sort of the whole place had something Sundayish about it. There was something elegiac about my father's letters when he talked about spring. And he said, well, every year it's the same, but it still gives one joy. And I've almost felt that this was a goodbye to life, you know.
Parents' letters to their children never mentioned the poverty and hardship they faced. They didn't want to burden them with the tragedy of not being able to work in their established profession. Instead, some early letters spoke of attempts to start a new life in a new country. Vera Shanfield's father had been a prominent lawyer and her mother a medical doctor.
My parents' letters were full of the places that they were trying to get permits to go to. And I really thought that each time I got a letter, or well, soon there'll be a letter saying, come and join us in Argentina, or we're waiting for you in Shanghai. And I really expected this to be a short-term thing. And I think my guardians thought too that they were having me for a short time.
From the information he received from Prague in the late summer of 1939, Winton could see the writing on the wall.
The important thing at that time was that I and the people I was working with, and the people in Prague, thought the matter was urgent, whereas they didn't. A lot of, even the Home Office at times said, I don't know why you're so rushed with all this, nothing's going to happen.
On the 1st of September 1939, another Winton train was scheduled to leave Prague station at midnight, but it never left. The Second World War broke out. It meant the end of Winton's rescue mission, and it meant Eve Leadbeater would never see her brother again.
My brother was due to come on the day that war broke out, and his train was cancelled. I didn't realise what it really meant. He was a lovely brother.
After war was declared, there was a further crackdown on the Jewish community in Czechoslovakia and a purge on any political opponents of the Nazis who were put in forced labor camps or deported to concentration camps in Poland. Suzanne Medas's father was on Hitler's hit list, and when letters from her parents stopped, she feared the worst.
I didn't hear anything until January 1940, when I suddenly got a postcard from my father from Oslo in Norway. And until Norway was occupied, I had correspondence with my father and mother. They were very poor. I don't know who supported them. Maybe the Jewish community in Norway, maybe the Red Cross.
In September 1940, the Blitz on Britain began, presenting a new challenge for the Winton children living in the Blitz towns and cities. Thoughts of home were pushed to the back of the mind of Harry Stadler and his brother, who were living with their guardian parents in London.
We were so concerned with day-to-day survival that I think we did not really spend enough time thinking of what was happening to our parents. We knew, of course, that there was no fighting in the immediate neighborhood of where they were living, and therefore they weren't as much in the firing line, in all probability, as we were.
In fact, a few were very much in the firing line. Gerda Meyer's father escaped from Czechoslovakia and fought against Hitler on the Eastern Front. But Jews who fought alongside Stalin's army were in double jeopardy.
He wrote as if he'd had a tremendous adventure. He just said, I and a few companions have come here, and we were welcomed by the Russians, and he was very upbeat, but he must have had a very, very bad time of it. Stalin was very suspicious of all foreigners and started shipping them out to these camps. And they were so badly managed that my father probably just didn't have enough to eat, I should think.
Gerda discovered after the war that her beloved father had died in one of Stalin's labor camps in the Soviet Union. But during the war, the Winton children had little idea what had happened to their parents and the rest of their families. Nazi propaganda promoted the idea that Czech Jewish families were alive and well. It showed them living happily in the Terezín concentration camp, where many were sent. It was a lie. Eve Leadbeater's parents and her brother Tommy were sent to Terezín in 1942, and they sent her letters via the Red Cross from there.
They were very short letters, but they were always very calm and encouraging and telling me to be good and to wash my neck and work hard and obey my English mother and so on, and saying that they were all well.
In fact, Terezín was the first stage of a mass deportation of Czech Jews to the Auschwitz death camps. The Nazis disguised their extermination plans with phrases like transport to the east. Suzanne Medas wrote a last letter to her parents who'd been taken there after the Nazi occupation of Norway.
I'm holding in my hand a letter which I wrote in February 1942 to my parents. And it is in German, but I will just translate it roughly and say that something to the effect that, how are you? And I can't share your sorrow, but I hope that you're well.
Though the deaths of those who entered the concentration camps was kept secret, most Jews feared the worst. The last letter Gerda Meyer received from her mother showed extraordinary courage.
Mother wrote me her last Red Cross letter, of course confined to a few words, and wrote, before I leave, 1,000 kisses. I pray you for you daily. Then she gave her number, and then she said, have courage, which I thought was lovely.
The full horror of the Holocaust was not exposed until after the war. So when Czechoslovakia was liberated, Vera Shanfield hoped against hope that she might return home to be reunited with her parents.
When the war ended, I couldn't imagine that my parents weren't alive anymore. And I was thinking, my goodness, I'm going to go back home. And I thought, I've forgotten all my Czech. What's going to happen? And I thought, I'll have to stay down a class. And then I thought, maybe I have to stay down 2 classes. And it wasn't until we heard through the Red Cross what had happened that I realized that my parents were dead, my grandmother was dead, that there was really no one to go back to.
Vera Penny had not heard from her parents since their last letter in 1942. She knew that there was little chance they could have survived.
News started to slip through about concentration camps, and my uncle had talked with the Red Cross and written to them, and he'd got paperwork through that my parents were both exterminated. But not in those words. The Germans were very good at painting things differently.
After the war, the Czech government established a centre for tracing missing relatives in Prague. But some Winton children had to wait many years before finding out any information. Harry Stadler didn't discover the fate of his parents until 1991, when he received a letter from the Terezin archives.
Stadler Otto was deported to Ghetto Terezin with the transport X776 from Prague on February the 12th, 1942. He left Ghetto with the transport AB608 for Izbica in Poland on March 17th, 1942. Nobody there has survived at all, and everyone who passed through there was destined for one of the two extermination camps which the Germans had constructed in the neighborhood. We have no information that can tell us which of the two camps my mother and father were sent to. It is certain that upon arrival of the camp, at the camp, one of the camps, neither would have been alive for more than a few hours before they were gassed and cremated.
Suzanne Medes contacted a Red Cross centre which kept photographs and detailed documents on some of those who died in Auschwitz.
They sent me my father's death certificate. And on this death certificate, it said not only the day, but the precise time of the day when he died. And I have since been told that in cases like that, it could be that he was shot rather than gassed. Now, they were after my father from 1933 when he escaped them. He escaped to Czechoslovakia, he escaped to Norway. Finally, they got him. They were going to make sure that they would have him for good.
For years, some of the Winton children clung to dreams that life could be as it used to be in Czechoslovakia after the war was over. But there was no family to come home to, and many remained in Britain. The heartbreak of coming to terms with the loss of her mother, her father, and her brother was unbearable for Eve Leadbeater.
I used to fantasize that they had escaped and that they were hiding out somewhere, and that once the war was over, we would all meet again. I imagined how they wouldn't recognize me to begin with, and I wouldn't recognize them. I made up all sorts of little stories of how we would be sure that it was, that I was who I was and that they were who they were, and how it would all be fine again. But it didn't happen.
For Eve, seeing the names of the family she lost commemorated on the walls of a synagogue in Prague helped bring a sense of closure. But one mystery remained for the children who escaped the Holocaust. Who exactly was the Englishman in Wenceslas Square who saved them? Nicholas Winton is now 101, a remarkably youthful centenarian. The retired businessman lives in a modest home near Maidenhead. After the war, he threw himself into charitable work with the elderly and told nobody, not even his wife, about helping so many children to escape from the Nazis. Though quietly proud of his achievement, he was sad that he was unable to save the children due to leave on the last train from Prague for London.
The only real regret I had in the whole process was what was the last, and happened actually to be the biggest transport of 250 children, which would have left on the day war broke out. Of course, they never left. All those children were condemned, really. They were completely exposed.
But for most of the 669 Winton children who got away, like Suzanne Medes, life turned out well. Suzanne treasures the photos from her childhood she brought with her from Prague. They provide a lasting memory for her own family of a happy life that was cut brutally short.
This is the first day at school. Every German school child got this lovely cone full of goodies to compensate us for having to go to school. The reason I have photographs from my childhood and even of my parents and grandparents is because when I left Prague, I said to my mother, let me take these photographs out and put them in an envelope and take them with me so that I have the memories. You keep the album. When we're together again, we'll stick them back.
Winton child Vera Shenfield also treasures photographs of herself as a girl and of her parents that she brought with her. However, most precious of all in helping to keep their memory alive is their wedding rings.
My parents managed to send their wedding rings to friends in Holland who gave them to me after the war. And I can't imagine at what moment they took their wedding rings off their fingers and sent them so that I could have something so precious that belonged to them. And this is the ring that I got married with.
Winton child Gerda Meyer became a poet, partly inspired by memories of visits to the countryside with her parents. She has published several collections of verse and writings. One, Make Believe, contains an urgent message for her father.
Say I were not 60, say you weren't near 100, say you were alive. Say my verse was read in some distant country, and say you were idly turning the pages. The blood washed from your shirt, the tears from your eyes, the earth from your bones. That is why at 60, when some publisher asks me for biographical details, I still carefully give the year of my birth, the name of my hometown. Gerda Meyer, born 27, in Karlsbad, Czechoslovakia. Write to me, Father.
The story of the rescue of the 669 children from Prague by Nicholas Winton was not revealed until almost 50 years later. In 1988, he met some of the children for the first time since 1939. The event was filmed live in an Esther Ranson show.
Vera Gissing is with us here tonight. Hello, Vera. And I should tell you that you are actually sitting next to Nicholas Winton. Hello. Is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
One of the Winton children in the audience was Eve Leadbeater.
To have seen Nicholas Winton for the first time, when it was revealed that he was the man who, to whom we owed our lives, that was just unbelievable. It was just like a fairy tale. What really moved me was my husband, who was there with me. Going up to Nicholas Winton afterwards during the hospitality, and just saying thank you. And that's quite moving, really, that somebody loves you enough to thank somebody for saving your life.
"70 years after they left Czechoslovakia on one of the Winton trains, many of the Winton children took part in a commemorative journey from Prague to Liverpool Street Station. There to greet them, as in 1939, was the ever-modest Nicholas Winton. Knighted in March 2003, Sir Nicholas Winton is Britain's secret Schindler.
I can only be satisfied that what I did at the time was the right thing. To think that my precepts of life, if something's not impossible, there must be a way of doing it, does work.
Absolutely amazing. Now then, this Tuesday on Channel 5, we bring you a look at Gladiators with Rome Unwrapped, brand new at 8. Next tonight, though, it's family honour at stake as the hands of us evil Brits, with Mel Gibson starring in The Patriot.